At 22:47 on June 3, 1944, Adolfo Kaminsky stood shirtless in a sixth-floor attic on the Rue des Saints-Pères, Paris, holding a paintbrush 2 mm wide over a French identity card. 18 years old. The brush tip carried lactic acid extracted from curdled milk. Below the brush, the word Juif stamped in red Waterman ink, 15 mm by 35 mm, blocking the life of a 16-year-old girl named Sarah. One stroke too heavy and the paper would tear, 1 second too long, and the acid would burn through the Bristol stock and leave a hole where a life should be. The contradiction was this. Behind him sat a Singer sewing machine, its pedal silent, its needle modified to punch perforations through identity photos. Around the room, oil paint tubes and canvases leaned against walls, the turpentine stink masking the chemical smell of forging. The problem was mathematical and absolute. 900 documents in 72 hours, 3 documents per child, 300 children on a deportation list. The Gestapo prefecture sat 1 kilometers away, 12 minutes on foot across the Pont Saint-Michel. Adolfo had been forging documents for 4 months. He had saved perhaps 2,000 people. But this was different. This was an entire generation compressed into 3 days. And the equation that haunted him was simple. In 1 hour he could produce 30 documents. If he slept 1 hour, 30 people died. 3 months earlier, Adolfo Kaminsky had not known what lactic acid could do to Waterman Blue ink. He had been a Jewish teenager working in his uncle's dairy in Vire, testing milk fat content using the Gerber method, which required lactic acid at industrial concentration. The acid separated cream from milk. It measured butterfat percentages. It had nothing to do with forgery until March 23, 1941, when his mother Anna travelled from Vire to Paris to warn her brother about an imminent arrest. She took the morning train. Her body was found on the tracks that evening. The official report said accident. The family knew otherwise. Adolfo was 16. His father forbade him from seeing the body. He learned the truth 3 weeks later when a neighbour told him his mother had been pushed, or shot, or beaten and thrown from the moving train. The neighbour did not know which, only that she had been killed for being Jewish and trying to save another Jew. Adolfo kept working at the dairy. He kept testing milk. He kept reading the chemistry book he had bought at a flea market months before, a thick volume by Marcellin Berthelot titled Chimie Organique Fondée sur la Synthèse. Berthelot had been the father of synthetic chemistry in the 19th century. The book contained chapters on medieval dyes and the chemical structures of supposedly indelible inks. Adolfo read those chapters at night in his room above the dairy, not knowing why they interested him, only that they did. On October 22, 1943, at 06:15, the Gestapo arrested Adolfo's entire family. They were taken to Drancy, a modernist housing complex northeast of Paris that the French government had converted into an internment camp. The complex had been designed for 700 residents. It held 7,000. The camp was shaped like a horseshoe, 3 stories of concrete and wire, unfinished construction from before the war. Adolfo was assigned to a room with 43 other men. The room had been designed for 6. There were no beds. Men slept on concrete. Adolfo watched the deportations. Convoy number 60 departed October 7th with 1,000 people. Convoy number 61 departed October 28th with 1,000 people. Convoy number 62 departed November 20th with 1,000 people. He did the mathematics. 1,000 people per convoy. 1 convoy every 3 weeks. 12 weeks in Drancy meant watching 4,000 people depart for camps in Poland, whose names no one spoke aloud but everyone knew. On January 28, 1944, Adolfo was released. Not because of justice or mercy or resistance action, but because of bureaucratic chance. His father had been born in Argentina. The family held Argentine passports. Argentina was neutral. The consulate intervened. Adolfo walked out of Drancy while 6,800 others remained. His father told him the family needed false documents. Adolfo was sent to find a forger. In early February 1944, Adolfo stood outside the Sorbonne holding his own identity card, the red stamp UEF obliterating his legal existence in France. A man approached him, mid-30s, civilian clothes, eyes that scanned the street in systematic sweeps. The man asked what Adolfo needed. Adolfo said documents. The man asked what Adolfo could pay. Adolfo said he had no money but he had skills. The man asked what skills. Adolfo mentioned the dairy, the Gerber fat test, lactic acid. The man stopped walking. He turned. He asked if Adolfo knew how to remove Waterman Blue ink. Adolfo said yes. Lactic acid dissolves methylene blue dye base without destroying paper fiber if applied at the correct concentration and neutralized with distilled water. The man stared at him for 11 seconds. Then he said, "Follow me." They walked to 17 Rue des Saints-Pères, a 7-story Haussmann building in the 6th arrondissement, narrow facade, wrought iron balconies, mansard roof. They climbed 6 flights, no elevator. The attic studio at the top was 40 square meters, sloped ceiling, a single window facing south toward the Luxembourg Gardens. Inside were 2 other people, Suzy Schidlof, 19 years old, studying fine arts before the occupation, now working as a courier and document specialist, and an older man who was never introduced by name. The room was staged as an artist's studio, easels, stretched canvases, tubes of oil paint, brushes soaking in turpentine jars. The smell was authentic because the work was authentic. Suzy painted in her spare time, but beneath a drop cloth in the corner sat the real equipment, a Singer sewing machine, bottles of chemicals, stacks of blank identity cards, a camera, and a wooden crate containing rubber stamps, ink pads, and metal type. The man who had recruited Adolfo placed an identity card on the table. The card belonged to a man named Samuel Weinberg. The Juif stamp was 15 mits by 35 mm, red ink, sans serif block letters. The man said, "If you can remove that stamp without leaving a trace, you have a job. If you cannot, leave and forget this address." Adolfo examined the card. Standard carte d'identité, Third Republic issue, beige Bristol paper, approximately 170 grams per square meter, folded in 3 sections measuring 250 millimeters by 150 mm when open. The stamp had been applied with force. The ink had soaked into the paper fiber. Mechanical scraping would destroy the texture. Chemical bleaching would discolor the entire card. But lactic acid would selectively dissolve the methylene blue without affecting the paper's lignin structure. Adolfo asked for lactic acid, distilled water, cotton swabs, blotting paper, and 12 hours. They gave him everything except the 12 hours. They said, "You have 2 hours." Adolfo worked at the table under a single electric lamp. He applied the lactic acid with a cotton swab, using minimal pressure, allowing capillary action to draw the acid into the ink. The blue began to dissolve. He blotted the dissolved ink with absorbent paper. He repeated the process 6 times, removing the stamp in layers. After each application, he neutralized the residual acid with distilled water to prevent long-term paper degradation. When he finished, the card showed no trace of the stamp. The paper was intact. The texture was uniform. Under magnification, the fibers showed no damage. The man who had recruited him examined the card for 3 minutes without speaking. Then he said, "When can you start?" Adolfo said now. The laboratory operated under the cover of an art studio, but the security protocols were military. No one used real names. No one discussed the resistance network structure. No one mentioned addresses or contacts outside the immediate team. The location was chosen for its contradictions. 1 kilometers from the Préfecture de Police on the Ile de la Cité. 4 2 kilometers from Gestapo headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch, in a neighborhood frequented by German officers visiting the cafés of Saint-Germain-des-Prés. The strategy was that the Gestapo would not expect a forgery operation to function in plain view, 6 floors above a street where Wehrmacht soldiers bought cigarettes every morning. The first document Adolfo completed took 45 minutes. The process required precision at every stage. First, chemical removal of the Juif stamp using lactic acid. Second, alteration of biographical data using a straight razor to scrape existing text and a typewriter to insert new information. Third, application of official stamps using carved rubber molds. Fourth, perforation of the identity photo using the modified sewing machine needle. The singer had been altered specifically for this purpose. The sewing needle had been filed to a blunt point and hardened in a blacksmith's forge. When Suzy operated the foot pedal, the needle punched through the photograph and the cardstock beneath, creating a perforation pattern identical to the fiscal stamp cancellation used by French prefectures. The perforation served 2 purposes. It validated the authenticity of the photo attachment, and it made photo substitution impossible without visible evidence of tampering. Each document required 12 separate operations. By the end of the first week, Adolfo had reduced the production time to 12 minutes per document. The demand accelerated through March and April 1944. The laboratory produced 30 documents per day, then 50, then 70. The work was divided into shifts. Adolfo handled chemical processing from 06 sounds to 14 sounds. Suzy handled typographic work from 14 sounds to 22 sounds. The unnamed man handled photography and stamp production at night. They operated 7 days per week without breaks. The volume created supply problems. They needed blank identity cards, ration cards, birth certificates, baptismal certificates. Blank documents could not be stolen in large quantities without triggering Gestapo investigations. The solution was to manufacture blanks from scratch. They purchased Bristol paper stock from stationers across Paris, never buying more than 5 sheets per shop. They mixed inks using pigments and binders purchased separately. They fabricated official stamps by carving designs into rubber gaskets and metal plates. The work required tools, scalpels, files, hammers, typewriter ribbon, photographic chemicals. Adolfo burned his right hand in April while melting metal for stamp molds. He worked left-handed for 3 days while the burn healed. No one suggested he rest. In mid-April, Gestapo units raided a forgery operation in the 11th arrondissement. The forgers were arrested and executed. The Gestapo announcement specified the detection method: ultraviolet light examination revealing chemical traces and mechanical alterations invisible under normal illumination. Adolfo tested his documents under a borrowed UV lamp. The results confirmed what the chemistry predicted. Lactic acid left no fluorescent residue. Mechanical scraping created fiber damage that glowed under UV. Chemical bleaching created uneven luminescence. But lactic acid dissolution left the paper structure intact and chemically neutral. The documents were undetectable, but the raid created a new problem. The Gestapo now knew forgery operations existed. They increased street inspections. German soldiers and French police checked identity cards at random checkpoints, metro stations, and rationing offices. Every document issued from the Rue des Saints-Pères laboratory became a potential exposure point. If one document was detected as false, the entire network could be traced through the forging techniques. Adolfo implemented a protocol. Each document used slightly different methods for stamp application and typographic style to prevent pattern recognition. No 2 documents were identical in construction. At the end of April, the requests shifted. Families no longer wanted only identity cards. They needed ration cards. Without ration cards, you could not purchase food legally. Jews whose identity cards had been de-Judaized still could not eat without ration cards. The cards presented a technical problem. They contained watermarks and complex stamp patterns that could not be reproduced with available equipment. Adolfo developed a workaround. He used dry embossing to create false watermarks by pressing the paper against an engraved metal plate under high pressure. Then he applied translucent oil to the reverse side, to simulate the optical properties of genuine watermarks when held against light. The forgery was imperfect but functional. Under casual inspection, the cards passed. Under detailed examination by an expert, they would fail, but detailed examination required suspicion. If the card's holder appeared calm and the biographical data matched the physical description, inspections remained cursory. Adolfo taught the recipients how to behave during inspections, maintain eye contact, answer questions directly, never volunteer additional information, never appear nervous. Fear was the tell that triggered detailed examination. On June 3, 1944, at 14:30, 2 members of La Sixième Resistance Network arrived at the laboratory. They brought information. 300 children in Catholic institutions across Paris had been identified by the Gestapo as Jewish children hidden under false names. The deportation order would be executed in 3 days. The children needed documents immediately: complete identity packages, birth certificate, baptismal certificate, ration card. 3 documents per child, 900 documents total. Deadline, 72 hours. Adolfo calculated the mathematics. 900 documents divided by 72 hours equals 12. 5 documents per hour. Continuous production without sleep, without food breaks, without error. The resistance members asked if it was possible. Adolfo said yes. Suzy looked at him. She knew the mathematics. She knew what it required. She said nothing. At 22:47 on June 3rd, Adolfo removed his shirt and began working. The attic was hot. Paris in June. No ventilation except the single window which could not be opened wide because light security required blackout curtains. Sweat made his hands slippery. He worked the first identity card. Lactic acid applied with the 2-meter brush. Wait for dissolution. Blot the dissolved ink. Neutralize with distilled water. Move to the typewriter. Enter new biographical data. Move to the stamp station. Apply the prefecture stamps. Move to the sewing machine where Suzy waited. Photo perforation. Document complete. Time elapsed. 11 minutes. He started the second document. By midnight, he had completed 19 documents. By 04:00 on June 4th, he had completed 57 documents. His hands were shaking. The brush slipped twice. He had to restart one document after tearing the paper. By 10 hours, he had completed 130 documents. Suzy collapsed at 11 hours. She was unconscious for 18 minutes. When she woke, she returned to the sewing machine without speaking. By 18 hours on June 4th, they had completed 298 documents. Adolfo's vision was narrowing. He could see only what was directly in front of him. Peripheral vision had disappeared. Tunnel vision caused by exhaustion and sustained close focus. By midnight on June 5th, they had completed 580 documents. Adolfo's hands were bleeding. Repeated pressure on the brush handle had torn the skin between his thumb and forefinger. He wrapped the hand in gauze and continued working. By 10:04 on June 6th, they had completed 820 documents, 80 documents remaining. By 22, they had completed 870 documents, 30 documents remaining. At 02:17 on June 7th, Adolfo completed the 900th document. Total time elapsed, 75 hours, 30 minutes. They had exceeded the deadline by 3 hours. The documents were packed into cardboard boxes and removed from the laboratory by couriers. The children were dispersed to locations across rural France, convents in Normandy and Brittany, farm families who agreed to hide children, and resistance escape routes leading to Switzerland via Annemasse and to Spain via the Pyrenees. Adolfo did not know if the documents would work. He did not know if the children would survive. He would not know for years. In June 1944, he knew only that 900 documents had been produced, and that was the limit of what he could control. 2 weeks later, a courier returned to the laboratory. One of the document batches was failing. 30 identity cards were yellowing. The paper was discolored. Adolfo examined the cards and understood immediately. He had forgotten to neutralize the lactic acid residue. In his exhaustion during the 72-hour production sprint, he had skipped the distilled water rinse on 30 cards. The acid was continuing to react with the paper, slowly degrading the cellulose and causing oxidation that appeared as yellow-brown discoloration. The cards would eventually become obviously altered. The 30 people carrying those cards needed new documents immediately. Adolfo reforged all 30 cards in 2 days. He never learned if the original cardholders had been caught before receiving the replacements. 2 people from that group of 30 disappeared from contact. Whether they were arrested, deported, or simply fled to other regions was never confirmed. Between February and August 1944, the laboratory on the Rue des Saints-Pères produced approximately 14,000 forged documents. The number is an estimate based on paper consumption, chemical usage, and courier logs. No precise records were kept because precise records would have been evidence if discovered. The documents included identity cards, ration cards, birth certificates, baptismal certificates, work permits, travel permits, and in some cases, entirely fabricated personal histories with supporting documentation covering multiple years of supposed residence in French towns. The production rate averaged 500 documents per week during peak periods. The laboratory operated 6 days per week, Sunday reserved for equipment maintenance and chemical resupply. The primary chemical supplier was a pharmacist in the 13th arrondissement who provided lactic acid, distilled water, and photographic developer under the cover of medical supplies. The pharmacist was arrested by the Gestapo in July 1944. He was tortured but revealed nothing. He died in custody. His name was never recorded in resistance archives because he had requested anonymity. On August 19, 1944, barricades began appearing in Paris streets. The Paris police went on strike. The resistance declared an uprising. By August 20th, fighting had spread across the city. The Rue des Saints-Pères was in a contested zone. German tanks held positions at the Luxembourg Gardens, 400 meters south. FFI forces held positions at the Boulevard Saint-Germain, 200 meters north. The laboratory ceased forgery operations. The equipment was dismantled and hidden in 3 separate locations. Adolfo and Suzy moved to a safe house in the 14th arrondissement. On August 25th, Paris was liberated. American tanks entered the city from the south. General Leclerc's Free French 2nd Armored Division entered from the west. German forces surrendered or retreated. Adolfo returned to the Rue des Saints-Pères on August 26th. The building was intact. The attic laboratory was untouched. The Gestapo had never found it. 12 minutes on foot from the Préfecture de Police, and they never found it. After the liberation, Adolfo Kaminsky continued forging documents, not for France, for other causes. In 1946, he forged documents for Jewish refugees trying to reach Palestine illegally, bypassing the British blockade. In 1954, he forged documents for the Algerian FLN during the War for Independence. In 1961, he participated in an operation to produce 100 million French francs in counterfeit currency intended to destabilize the French economy as leverage for Algerian negotiations. The team worked for 6 months. The counterfeit notes were chemically and physically perfect. When the Algerian ceasefire was declared, the entire stock of counterfeit currency was burned. No one in the operation considered keeping the money. In the 1960s and 1970s, Adolfo forged documents for resistance movements in 12 countries: Spain under Franco, Portugal under Salazar, Greece under the military junta, and various movements in Latin America and Africa. He forged passports for American draft resistors fleeing to Canada during the Vietnam War. In 1971, he was targeted in a sting operation. Someone requested forged South African passports for anti-apartheid activists. The request was a trap, likely organized by South African security services. Adolfo recognized the setup and refused the job. That was the last time he forged a document. He was 46 years old. He had been forging for 30 years. Adolfo Kaminsky did not speak publicly about his work for decades. He became a photographer. He lived quietly in Paris. In 1992, he was granted French citizenship. In 2009, His daughter Sarah convinced him to write his autobiography. The book, Adolfo Kaminsky, Une vie de faussaire, was published in French. An English translation, The Forger, appeared later. In 2016, a documentary about his life was released. In his final years, Adolfo visited schools and spoke to students about resistance and the small actions that can save lives. He never used the word hero. He described his work as a technical problem that required a technical solution. When asked how he dealt with the pressure of knowing that errors meant death, he said he simply did not allow himself to make errors. On January 9, 2023, Adolfo Kaminsky died in Paris. He was 97 years old. At the time of his death, he was one of the last surviving members of the Jewish resistance networks that had operated in occupied France. The French government honored him posthumously. The Shoah Memorial in Paris preserves examples of his forged documents in its permanent collection. The documents appear authentic because they were authentic in every way except the information they contained. The lactic acid method Adolfo developed was so effective that modern forensic analysis still cannot detect the alterations without destructive testing. The Singer sewing machine he used is not preserved in any museum. The brush is gone. The bottles of lactic acid are gone. What remains are the documents and the 14,000 people who survived because an 18-year-old boy who worked in a dairy knew that acid dissolves ink. The mathematics were always simple for Adolfo. 1 hour of work equals 30 documents. 30 documents equals 30 lives. 1 hour of sleep equals 30 deaths. So he did not sleep. For 72 hours, he did not sleep. And 300 children lived. That was the equation. That was the only equation that mattered. In the years after the war, survivors asked him how he managed the pressure, how he lived with the knowledge of what would happen if he failed. He always gave the same answer. He said he was a chemist. He said chemistry does not allow for pressure or fear or doubt. You either execute the procedure correctly or you do not. There is no middle ground. You apply the acid at the correct concentration for the correct duration and neutralize at the correct moment, or the paper is destroyed. There is no room for error, so you do not make errors. The survivor would ask if he ever made errors. He would say yes, once, 30 documents during the 72-hour operation. I forgot to neutralize the residue. The survivor would ask what happened to those 30 people. He would say, I do not know, 2 of them disappeared. I never learned if they died or escaped. The conversation would end there. Adolfo never offered more detail. The work had been technical. The results were technical. Some people lived. Some people may have died. The numbers were unknowable. What was knowable was that 14,000 documents were produced and 14,000 people had the opportunity to survive because of those documents. That was the only measurement that had meaning. The forger's tools were mundane. A paintbrush, a sewing machine, a bottle of acid extracted from spoiled milk. The genius was not in the tools, but in understanding the chemistry deeply enough to know that methylene blue dye is soluble in lactic acid, that Bristol paper fibre remains intact under acid exposure if neutralized promptly, that bureaucratic inspection relies on pattern recognition and can be defeated by perfect replication of expected patterns. Adolfo learned the chemistry in a dairy testing milk fat. He learned the bureaucracy by observing how German soldiers and French police inspected documents at checkpoints. He learned the psychology by watching people present false documents and noting which behaviors triggered suspicion and which did not. The combination of chemistry, bureaucracy, and psychology created a system that saved thousands of lives using tools that cost less than 50 francs. The expense was not in the equipment, but in the time. Time was the only resource that could not be replaced. Every hour spent forging was an hour of exposure to arrest, torture, execution. Every document produced increased the risk that the laboratory would be discovered, and yet the laboratory operated for 6 months in the center of occupied Paris, 1 kilometers from the police who were hunting for exactly this kind of operation, and was never found. The reason it was never found was not luck. The reason was discipline. No one spoke about the work. No one kept records. No one met in public. No one deviated from the cover story. The laboratory was an art studio. The people inside were artists. The smell of turpentine was real. The oil paintings were real. Everything was real except the identity of the people working there and the nature of the work being done. The forgery was not in the documents. The forgery was in the entire existence they presented to the world, and the world believed it because the details were perfect. If a young man today wanted to replicate what Adolfo Kaminsky did, he could not. The chemistry remains the same. Lactic acid still dissolves methylene blue, but the documents have changed. Modern identity cards contain holograms, embedded chips, biometric data, encrypted information. The technology has made forgery exponentially more difficult, but the principle remains unchanged. Every security system has vulnerabilities. Every bureaucracy has patterns. Every inspector has limitations on attention and expertise. The question is whether someone with sufficient skill, sufficient knowledge, and sufficient commitment can identify and exploit those vulnerabilities. Adolfo proved that one person can. One 18-year-old with a chemistry book and a sewing machine, working in an attic with no formal training, produced documents that fooled the Gestapo for 6 months and saved 14,000 lives. The documents were not perfect. Experts could have detected the forgeries under detailed laboratory analysis. But detailed laboratory analysis was never performed because the documents never triggered suspicion. They passed the only test that mattered: the visual inspection by a soldier or policeman who examined the document for 5 seconds and handed it back. That 5-second inspection was the gap between life and death. Adolfo engineered documents that survived that 5 seconds 14,000 times. The last people to see Adolfo Kaminsky before he died were his family and a group of students from a high school in the 18th arrondissement who had invited him to speak about resistance during the occupation. He was 97 years old. He required assistance to walk. His hands shook from age, not fear. He told the students the same thing he had told every group he spoke to in his final years. He said, "I was not a hero, I was a technician." He said the heroes were the people who carried the false documents knowing they could be arrested at any moment. He said the heroes were the families who hid Jewish children knowing they would be executed if discovered. He said the heroes were the couriers who moved through checkpoints every day carrying messages and documents. He said, "I sat in a room and did chemistry. That is not heroism, that is work." The students asked if he was ever afraid. He said yes, constantly, every day, every time a courier left with documents, every time I heard boots on the stairs, every time the Gestapo increased patrols in the neighborhood. The students asked how he continued working if he was afraid. He said because the alternative was watching people die. The students asked if he would do it again. He said without hesitation, yes. One student asked if the experience changed him. Adolfo paused. He said, "Yes, it taught me that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they are placed in situations that require it. I was not extraordinary, I was ordinary. The situation was extraordinary." The student asked what he wanted people to remember about his story. Adolfo said, "I want people to remember that every person they see on the street, every person they pass without noticing, has the capacity to save lives if they choose to use it. I want people to understand that resistance is not about grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Resistance is about doing the small things that need to be done every day until the work is finished." That was the last public statement Adolfo Kaminsky made. He died 6 weeks later. The Shoah Memorial in Paris holds 17 forged documents produced by Adolfo Kaminsky between 1943 and 1944. The documents are stored in climate-controlled archives, protected from light and moisture. They are removed for display only during special exhibitions. When examined under magnification, the documents reveal no trace of chemical alteration. The paper shows no fiber damage. The ink shows no discoloration. The stamps show no irregularities. The documents are perfect forgeries, or more accurately, they are perfect documents containing false information. There is no technical difference between a legitimate document and Adolfo's forgeries except the truthfulness of the data printed on them. That was the insight that made his work possible. A document is not authenticated by its physical properties, but by the bureaucratic system that validates it. If the document conforms to the expected format, if it contains the correct stamps, if it matches the bearer's appearance, then it is accepted as true. Truth is a social construct enforced by pattern recognition. Adolfo did not defeat the security features of French identity documents. He defeated the cognitive shortcuts of the inspectors who examined those documents. He understood that humans cannot perform detailed analysis on every document they inspect. They rely on heuristics. Does this look right? Does this feel right? Does this person seem trustworthy? Adolfo engineered documents that looked right, felt right, and taught the bearers how to seem trustworthy. The engineering was chemical and mechanical. The psychology was observational. The result was that 14,000 people survived the war. The number 14,000 is an estimate. The actual number could be higher or lower. No one counted. No one could count. The documents were produced and distributed through a network with no centralized record keeping. Many recipients of false documents never knew who forged them. Many never knew the documents were false. Some people survived the war and decades later discovered that the identity card that had saved them had been forged in an attic on the Rue des Saints-Pères by a teenager who worked 18 hours per day for 6 months. Some learned this from the 2009 book. Some learned from the 2016 documentary. Some never learned at all. They died believing their documents had been legitimate, which in a sense they were. The documents were legally invalid but functionally legitimate. They performed the social function of identity documents. They allowed the bearer to exist legally within the bureaucratic system of occupied France. That is the only function that matters. A document that does not function is not a document, it is paper. Adolfo's documents functioned. 14,000 times they functioned. That is not an estimate. That is a minimum. The true number is unknowable because the success of a forged document is invisible. Only failures leave evidence. There are no monuments to Adolfo Kaminsky in Paris. There are no plaques. There is no street named after him. The building at 17, Rue des Saints-Pères, still stands. It is a private residence. There is no marker indicating what happened on the 6th floor between February and August 1944. The anonymity is intentional. Adolfo requested no monuments. He wanted the work to speak for itself. And it does. The 14,000 people who survived, and their children, and their children's children, are the monument. They are walking through cities across the world, living lives that would not exist if an 18-year-old had not known that lactic acid dissolves Waterman Blue ink. That is the monument. That is the only monument that matters. Not stone or bronze or engraved names, but lives that continue because someone chose to sit in an attic and not sleep for 72 hours. If that story means something to you, if it changes how you think about what one person can do, then leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Share this story. Make sure Adolfo Kaminsky is not forgotten. Because the world needs to remember that ordinary tools in skilled hands can defeat extraordinary evil. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering.